welcome to the Maxim Institute podcast. My name is Jason. I'm the Communications Officer at Maxim Institute, and today we're celebrating the release of the latest edition of our annual magazine, Flint Steel. This latest edition, Volume 8, is available right now at flintandsteelmag.com. As soon as you finish listening to this podcast, you can jump over there and order it in time to read it on your summer break. This year's edition is all about the give and take, the perceived conflict between generations. We hear these memes all the time. Boomers have wrecked the world. Millennials are the entitled snowflakes. Gen Z are the hope for the future. And who were Gen X again? The magazine is packed full of great articles exploring this topic. And to celebrate, I'm joined today by our Executive Director, Tim Wilson, and one of our contributing authors, Josie Pagani, who is the Director of the Council of International Development. Welcome to the podcast, guys.
Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Now, Josie, you've written a wonderful article for us on this idea of the worship of youth and glorifying young people and the age of youth as the gold standard for life, the years we kind of all long to go back to. But before we get into all of that and dissecting the article, I wonder, having never been someone of high enough regard to warrant an interview with any news outlet, would you tell me, what is it like to be interviewed by the BBC?
That's very fun. I'm thinking of that wonderful player for the women's rugby team when she won the World Cup. And what does she call it? She called the BBC the Better Be on My Best Behaviour BBC or something like that. Right. I remember at the time, and I would have been, 13 or 14 or something like that. And we just thought it was the bee's knees and that we were really important. But we were really playing up to what we knew they wanted, which was for us to be terrified of nuclear war and nuclear bombs, and we needed to exaggerate that as much as possible to make it a good BBC show. But yeah, I mean, the BBC journalist, I remember he came around, he sat down in the field, the athletics field with us. We all sat around and you know, he kind of had this tilted head of compassion where he listened earnestly to a lot of rubbish that we all spoke, and we felt incredibly important.
I love that you begin your Flint and Steel article with that moment, because it really pegs on something that I've observed, which is, and look, I've been guilty of, I'm sure at times during my media career, which is the notion that young people, on account of their youth, have a special truth that is unavailable to anyone over a certain age. And it's often, you know, this is often repackaged, represented. It's at the heart of this whole generational divergence that we're seeing at the moment, don't you think?
Yeah, and also, you know, I look back on those teenage years and even into my early 20s, you know, I was riddled with anxiety, uncertainty. You know, to be honest, Tim, at that time, I was more concerned about whether I wore black eyeliner under my eyelids or over my eyelids. And, you know, the next day, I remember after that interview, I queued for about 2 hours to kiss Simon Le Bon at a Duran Duran concert. You know, so the idea that what I had to say about the threat of nuclear war was of great importance to the world, and the world needed to hear my opinion, was really not the case. You know, I mean, obviously, youth can push things along with a sort of wonderful, blind, fresh certainty and absolutism of what's right and wrong, and you need that. But the idea that that's the end of the story, that somehow if you're young and you've got that vision and certainty, and you know you absolutely think you're right, the idea that that's the end of it, that that's all you need to hear, that that's the most important thing you need to hear, is just not the case. And yeah, as I say, you know, mostly at that age, you're riddled with uncertainties, and you're trying to juggle your perception of the world as being, you know, deeply complicated, and your relationships are difficult, and it's, you know, it seems terribly compromised, with this absolute certainty that you're right.
Yeah, and look, I think that blinding idealism of youth, there is a scintillating clarity to it, and it's necessary. But if you need to put it, I think, in context, in the context of the whole canvas of generations. So there is the energy and idealism of youth. Then but fascinatingly, younger people typically aren't engaged politically. They're idealistic. They're highly politically. Maybe they may be able to speak about politics, but do they vote? Well, not as much as say young people. Certainly in New Zealand statistics, they start to vote from the age of 26 on, and it goes up as people age because they see the utility of it. I think it's really interesting, Josie, what you're saying, because I was about to say I don't like to play the blame game. Well, I think I do sometimes. That's fair enough. Everyone does. But I wonder if this is like an over-valorization of youth, or a reluctance by older generations to claim the moral authority that has typically been assigned to them in previous eras. I remember sitting in a speech made by a senior political figure to young people where he essentially said, you have nothing to learn from the past. Everything is in your hands. You go and do it, which to me is, it sounds almost like an ideological or generational year zero. It's a horrible thought.
Yeah, what rubbish, isn't it? Yeah, and the way I like to put it is that yes, you know, when you look back at some of the great movements in history, the civil rights movement, anti-apartheid, you know, Arab Spring, relatively recently, you know, Vietnam War, the marches against the Vietnam War, and so on. Yes, you know, young people had a huge role to play with the clarity of vision and the enthusiasm and the absolutism of it. But in the end, it was adults that got it done. You know, it was the adults in the room that did it. So it was, you know, LBJ in America who ended the awful era of Jim Crow. You know,
Wait. Are you saying Lyndon Baines Johnson was an adult? I'm going to pull you up on that. I've read the biography. Far from it. Anyway, let's keep going.
But yeah, you know, Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela. You know, these were adults, and so I think it's partly the fetishization of that youthful certainty, and then the sort of downgrading of maturity, which I don't like. And it's the idea that there's only one continuum, there's only one bit of the continuum of age, i.e. youth, where you've got something that's vital and important to say. No, that's not true. You know, and what a terrible message to give our young people that, you know, we're only really going to be interested in what you've got to say until a certain age. And then it's just some, you know, downward slope to a life of beige and washing the car at the weekend, you know, because we're not interested in you then because you're boring and suburban. What a load of rubbish.
I love, Josie, how you put it in your article where you say youth is an identity, or making youth your identity is like a summer romance. It has a time limit on it. And did you feel that ticking as you were going through this BBC interview? Did you feel that ticking, like I'm only valid now until I reach a certain age and then I don't have a valid opinion anymore? Is that something that you felt even back then?
Absolutely. I mean, you kind of knew that you were there not because of you hadn't demonstrated any great analysis or anything of great interest. You were there because you were representing the youth voice about, you know, the fear of nuclear war, and so you kind of played your part, and you have the sense of, you know, slightly fake sense. Not that we weren't terrified, because, you know, at that age you can terrify yourself with all sorts of things, but you know, there was a legitimate issue there, but yeah, it was that I had that sense of fakeness, and it's the same. I think maybe it's, you know, there's another thing there about joining clubs, isn't there, and identities, and I think you're right, Jason. The age thing, that, you know, the boomer, okay, boomer, millennials, you know, Gen X and so on, that there's a sense of it becoming an identity, like your ethnicity or your gender or something like that. And it just seems, you know, there's even some people, I think it was Pew Research who put out some research saying that now the differences between the generations are like a culture. You know, we've come from different cultures. I really reject that. I mean, I think it's not so much the difference in the ages is more like horoscopes. You read your horoscope, and yes, I'm Gemini. I identify with, I like to party, but I also like to be on my own. I'm this sort of complete opposites. And you go, oh yeah, that's me. And then you read something, you go, no, that's definitely not me. No, I don't like to, sit and read reams of history all weekend or something. So it's a bit like you identify with bits of your horoscope, you identify with bits of your generational title, but like the bands that you liked, or the ads that you saw on TV, or the food, the sweets that you bought at the shop, and so on. But it's not your identity.
No, people forget that Metallica and Madonna both came from the 80s.
Exactly.
Yeah. I'm actually still trying to forget that. So thank you very much for nothing, Jason.
You're more than welcome, Tim.
But you didn't cue to Kiss Simon Le Bon and Duran Duran, Tim. I'm sure that you wouldn't do, but lower yourself to that level.
Well, I've come to have an appreciation of the work of Duran Duran latterly, but at the time I was one of those sneering. That pop stuff, I'm too good for that. Let me put on some horrible, tuneless gothic dirge that will make me feel good about myself living in the suburbs in Whanganui. Hey, listen, just in terms of, I think you've touched on something that is perhaps part of a larger aspect of the way that we create our identity now. And that sense that identity is not something that you inherit, but identity is something that you curate for yourself based on what promotes your psychological well-being. So the notion of even of age as an objective reality is somewhat being sidelined in a sense, even as it's being enshrined by these modes that you're talking about. The notion that your generational culture defines you absolutely. It feels to me that there's like two countervailing approaches here, but somehow they're becoming entwined, and they're strangulating the ability of generations to actually connect with each other.
Yeah, and I mean, we know that we're living in times that feel more divided than ever, don't they? And the idea that, in this sort of Olympics of victimhood that we tend to, use in identity politics, it's like now we've added age, so that, whether you're a boomer or a millennial or a Gen X, you're more or less advantaged is the implication. And so, we're kind of adding all of these layers of like, a kind of, you can mix and match the sense of powerlessness that you want to feel and make and construct this identity of, fragility for yourself, one of which now is generational. And I just think actually the research counters that, because the research that I've seen shows that actually you're more likely to share the views of your parents, or your parents will be influenced by you. Actually the gap between the generations is not so great. So it's bigger in areas like the things that we would call identity, i.e., what you think about climate change, what you might think about culture or gender or so on. But when it comes to sort of the big issues about what you think about government, or what you think about regulation versus less regulation, more or less regulation, or economic development, or redistribution of wealth, or the sort of big issues that politics used to be about, there's a lot more similarity between the generations and a lot more agreement between parents and children.
Actually, it's that touches on something that came up during the discussions about lowering the voting age, which is that one of the counter arguments to that was that younger people tend to replicate the views of their parents. So you're not necessarily expanding the constituency of ideas by lowering the voting age. You're just echoing it in some sense. I do want to take out of you, Josie, lowering the voting age. Given the discussions we're having, where are you at on it, and why?
Golly, it's one of, having met my children, I don't think they should be voting at 16. But yeah, I mean, I just tend to think that, again, I like this idea of almost like a rite of passage that you become an adult, and we trust you to have the maturity of views and a sort of nuanced sense of views that, at a certain age, we think you're ready to make big decisions like voting. The idea that you vote at 16, I mean, I'm not, I suppose it's that I'm not convinced it's a big problem that you don't vote at 16. Therefore, I'm kind of agnostic on it. And then I also think, when I think back to myself at 16, when I look at my kids at 16, I mean, they're now older than that. They're a few years older than that, and their views have changed quite a lot. So, I just don't think it's a big enough issue for us to get overexcited about.
I really like that you brought up the identity markers there, Josie, because it seems like it's a bit of a modern issue, that in the past there was these ceremonies of passage from one stage of life to another, and you could point back to, now I've become an adult, and there was all this preparation for that. You're on your way to becoming an adult. Here's the ceremony that's going to mark it. Now you're an adult. And there wasn't so much of a generational split because there were the children and the adults. It's quite a modern problem, don't you think?
Yeah, and you're right. Those rites of passage. I mean, I work in the aid and development area. There's one, you probably come across it, but there's one in Vanuatu which used to be, they basically invented bungee jumping, and that was a rite of passage in Vanuatu. That
I've heard of this. It's like
it's wonderful.
It's bungee jumping without bungees. I think they use flax or something, don't they?
So it's basically a tree that creates these amazing vines, and you find the right vine, you hope, and your young sort of 16-year-old or something jumps off the tree and on this bungee, and hopefully doesn't kill themselves.
Is this a way of rite of passage or culling the foolish? I can't
what's
think
the
of
mortality rate there?
Yeah. But the thing I love about it is that the mother stands there with some item of from your childhood, like a teddy bear or something that's been part of your childhood, and you jump off the tree, and as long as you survive, they chuck the childish item away, and it's the rite of passage that you've now become an adult. And so there's a real celebration of maturity, of kind of throwing out childish things, right? And I think that's a really healthy thing. That's not to say your childhood is something that you want to kind of walk away from. It's that you don't have a choice, so you get older, and it's a really healthy way of saying, there's something about the certainties you feel in the classroom. I mean, gosh, I grew up in England, I was born in New Zealand, but I used to go on C&D marches, anti-nuclear marches, and I remember going up to one of the American camps, Greenham Common, and we were protesting against Trident missiles, and I was with my mother and all her friends, so these very nice, well-spoken middle-class women who were sort of singing awful songs and dancing, and across the fence is a whole bunch of working-class African-American soldiers, guarding the base, and I remember then thinking, well, I'm really uncomfortable about this. It's like, how is it that we're all a bunch of, middle-class liberals shouting at African-American working-class young men across the fence, telling them that they're evil and bad and terrible? So what I mean by that is the certainties that you feel as a child, like, this is wrong, this is right. Think of Greta Thunberg. That's not how you make good policy. It's not how you have the solutions to the complex problems the world faces, from climate change to poverty. So we should be celebrating that you can go from that absolute certainty to facing the complex world where compromise is inevitable. That's not a flaw in the system. That's a really, that's the point of our democratic system, that you have to work around things to make things happen, to make change happen.
Yeah, the ability to see grey is actually incredibly necessary, because the human experience is not blinding flashes of light or darkness. There is so much in between, and I'm not going, oh, woe is us, because there's just this elegant monochrome. Far from it. What I'm saying is that there are filigrees of of difference that we need to be attuned to if we're going to produce good policy, if we're going to be able to produce policy that actually understands the human condition accurately. Headlines are fantastic. They get your attention, but they don't nourish in the same way that kind of what is the word, the understanding that life is more complex than a headline, that will take you places.
Yeah, and the older you get, the more there's actually, again, there's science to back this up. You don't get sort of more stuck in your ways, actually. I mean, what you do, you acquire wisdom, you acquire experience. You know what it's like to fail. You know what it's like to have to work with people who don't think like you. With the unlike-minded, not just the like-minded. And so that I love that. I think it's Cicero. I can't remember, but it's an ancient Roman philosopher. But that quote of there's nothing more desirable to man than wisdom. And though age takes away everything else, beauty, youthfulness, it undoubtedly brings wisdom. And I actually believe that. I think life is a journey towards something. And so, again, if we're telling young people you're your best self at 15, 18, 20, what a terrible message when they've still got decades of life ahead of them.
Josie, I wonder if this is a particularly Western problem. The rite of passage that you brought up is from a non-Western culture, and we're talking about this idea of markers and identities and growing into our age and realizing that with that comes this ability to see the gray areas and to have a more nuanced view. Do you think there's something that we can learn from our non-Western neighbors around that might help us navigate this?
Yeah, give us a bit of respect as we get older. That's right. I mean, I do think, without being glib about it, that it's been an amazing piece of Western history, if you like, that we have understood better how to raise children. And part of that is to go, you're not just little adults, you are, the whole concept of youth and young people having a youth is relatively new, and it's really healthy. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It's about, I think, looking to whether it's Māori culture, whether it's cultures in the Pacific, where there is a place for everybody on the marae. It's not that you are, that if you're a young person with a strong view, you have a voice, but equally, you have a voice on the pai, you have a voice in the wharekai, you have a voice throughout that marae, no matter what your age. And in fact, you have a very clear role to play as you get older. And I think that's the thing is that, with the okay boomer thing is really ugly. That's a really nasty phase that we've gone through.
It's very dismissive, isn't it? It's like, well, you don't know what you're doing. You had your chance. You kind of get out, sort of thing.
Yeah, okay, boomer. You're unfashionable. You're probably old, male, and stale.
Hey, look, I just want to. I hear all of this, but I wonder what's part of the issue here is not just the over-valorization of youth, but a kind of abnegation of maturity. And you do touch on this in your piece, Josie. I actually, talking about those rites of passage, what are the rites of passage that would exist for, say, in your 30s, 40s, 50s, whereby that you're advancing to the state of Ciceronian wisdom? I don't think we have it in materialistic, consumeristic society in the West. It's absent. So with older people somehow at sea, and the only anchor being this over-valorization of youth, older people then try to behave like young people. So what are young people going to do? They're going to disrespect them.
Yeah, that's right. So that's the kind of, yes, you desperately try and hang on to your youth. And again, that's something, as a woman, middle-aged woman, you're kind of told that if you can maintain your youth, if you can look youthful, if you can, if someone says to you, wow, you look, you don't look your age at all, you go, oh, thank you very much. Well, what a odd thing. Like, of course.
It's like, haven't I experienced failure, self-disgust, low moments? What do you mean I don't look my age? I want to look my age. I am my age. How dare you?
How dare you? Yes, to quote Greta Thunberg, how dare you? And that's right. And it's a real shame that we're not allowing people to age gracefully. But the reason is that you're absolutely right. There is this sense that you've got to sort of hang on to youthfulness, and it's difficult. In the workplace, it's really hard. If you're in your 50s and you're coming back into the workplace, there's a really interesting theory that was put out by a woman called Anne-Marie Slaughter, who was Hillary Clinton's foreign affairs advisor. So she left her job with Hillary Clinton, and everyone went, how could you do that? You're in your 40s, you'll never get back on the career trail, you'll just go back and, teach at a university. And she made the point in a big Atlantic article that you've got to think about a woman's career, and I would say not just a woman's career, but anybody's career, as an arc over your entire lifetime, and that you will take time out to look after kids, you will take time out to go part-time, you'll step off and you'll come back into the workplace, maybe in your 40s, maybe your 50s, maybe your 60s, even into your 70s. But the idea is that you peak at a certain time, you peak in your 30s or you peak in your 40s, is not true, and especially not true for people who have kids who take time out. So we've got to completely rethink work. That I don't think I've done my best work, and I'm in my 50s. Why would we not think that you can still be the best that you can be in your life in older age?
Yeah, it's really interesting that you bring up that peak kind of time, where people say, oh, I've peaked at a certain age. And I still haven't discovered what that age is yet, Josie. I don't know. For ages, I felt too young. Then I felt too old to do some certain things. So I don't know. Is there an age? Do you have that in mind? Have you discovered the magical age where you're just right to get everything done?
Well, I did take my daughter a few years ago when she was about 15 to a Nicki Minaj concert, and I sat there thinking, I have no idea when one song has finished and the next one's begun. I thought, okay, it's time for me not to be going to pop concerts with my daughter.
That was exactly the rite of passage I've been begging for, Josie, which is when you're sitting there with your arms folded and a face like a dropped pie at a Nicki Minaj concert, then that's perhaps a sign that you are longing for more durable things, different joys, different delights.
Longing for some Duran Duran, Tim.
Yeah, although I have to say, Tim, I did have a pink baseball cap on with Nicki Minaj on it. So my glum face and my folded arms, it was like, that was a really pathetic moment. So yes, there's nothing worse than, adults trying to kind of, hang on to a youthfulness. But the reason they do that is that you're kind of terrified that you're losing relevancy, and so we have to sort of push back against that. We certainly have politicians, don't we? I mean, I'm thinking of some of our politicians. Or Grant Robinson was one where he kept talking about himself as a sort of student politician for a long time, as a sort of representative of young Labour and so on. And there was a point where he just quietly stopped doing that. And I think he'd almost gone beyond the age where you were allowed to do that. He was already in his sort of 40s, and you don't get to represent the youth after that.
No. Hey, look, I'm just in the spirit of offering something positive for listeners to take away. How do we defend against these attitudes that I think we're in general agreement that there is a poisonous and toxic aspect to them. When you read something on a news site, when you hear something, what is it that you can do to go, okay, you know what, this isn't correct. There's an assertion being made here, say, for example, that the generations are at war. In fact, they're interconnected. What advice do we have for people so that we can at least start to build a bulwark against this kind of wrong thinking that is corroding our relationships between the generations, our ability to build something amazing in this country?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the first things that needs to happen is that we need to actually see more diverse faces generationally in our media. And I mean, you and I know, Tim, in a lot of the media, TV news, even in radio, but more so in TV, there's this tendency to think that you've got to have, the youngest, most vibrant person fronting your news or doing your journalism or whatever. So, I mean, I think that, and that's not the case in other countries, not the case in America, where there are multiple generations, on TV. So I think that's the first thing, is making sure that, in the work that we do, that we're actually profiling people across different generations who've got different perspectives. But yeah, I do think it's just, in a narrative, it's about celebrating, not downgrading maturity, but actually celebrating what comes with maturity, and that sense of depth of wisdom, call it, or knowledge or whatever, and resisting that thing, I think, all the time, that thing of like, oh, you look younger, or how more valuable you are because you don't look as old as you are. Kind of resisting that stuff and just not doing it.
Yeah, and indeed, I think affirming the importance of age, and I was about to say utility, and I paused there because I don't want to. I think one of the things that help, or one of the pressures that helps create wisdom, is the waning of physical resources. So you are tempted to become more reflective, and you are thrown into a different. You're not there with the CND marching outside the base. And shouting at American soldiers. You're standing back and you're going, okay, so what's really going on here? So I think the question, and this is something you touch on in your piece for Flint and Steel, is that let's look at the real issues here. So the real issue might be something like economic inequality. Okay, let's talk about that. Let's not assign generational baggage to this, because that's distracting.
Yeah, and actually any identity is distracting, right? So it's like, yeah, if you can name the problem, get the problem definition right, and then work out, okay, who's best positioned to solve this problem, what do we know about the people who are at the receiving end of this problem? But you're right, I think any stereotype is unhelpful. So, not all Pākehā people are richer than non-Pākehā people. Not all boomers are richer than millennial tech entrepreneurs, for example. So the idea that you've got, boomers are wealthy and they've wrecked the planet, is not, just doesn't stack up as a fact. And so moving away from those stereotypes, being really clear about who's actually suffering. What is the problem you're trying to solve? Is it economic inequality? Is it climate change? Is it house prices? A woman on her own in her 50s trying to get a house is just as needy, just as in need as a young person trying to get a house. It's not, there shouldn't be this sort of distinction that somehow you can be on this pyramid intersectionality of need where your need is less or more than someone else. It's like, who knows what your circumstances are. So moving away from stereotypes is really important.
This is revolutionary. What you're saying is we need to step away from narratives that are associated with the individualization of victimization, and maybe move to a thing called, wait, are you saying objective truth? I can't believe it. Stop the podcast now.
Yeah, I mean, it's about, growing up to me is about, refusing to go back into those, very childlike ideals that seemed so easy when you were younger. But it's also about refusing to get cynical and resigned that there's nothing you can do to change the world. In other words, I believe I'm just as capable. In fact, I think I'm more capable of changing the world for the better now than I was when I sat down with the BBC age 13 or 14, pontificating on my views of the threat of nuclear war.
I like that you have kind of outlined this way of getting out of our certainties, because we can get trapped. It's easy to go back to what we've always said, the old phrases and the memes. But growing up, it takes work. It takes work to mature and to grow. And I like that you said in your article that there's plenty of people who are vital, engaged, and determined to be surprised and surprising into old age. And I think that takes a lot of work for us to do that. How could we maybe cultivate some of those ways of being surprising, do you think, Josie?
Well, I mean, the first thing, I guess, is to be surprising, isn't it?
Yeah.
So ourselves. And I always think, God, I've never been the age I am now. It's the first time. It's surprising for me to discover I'm in my 50s, and so every age you're at is the first time you've been that age. And so I think it's down to us all to you're right. I mean, to me, I hope life at its best feels like a constant stripping away of any of the rubbish that you've built around yourself to fully know yourself and fully be present in the world. And so you're kind of hopefully constantly becoming a better version of yourself. I mean, not always. It's like one step forward, two steps back. But so it's partly down to yourself. But I do think it's just, again, it's coming back to that, making sure that, you turn TV on in America, you're going to see people in their 70s, you're going to see people fronting shows in their 60s and 50s and 40s. And, you're not going to just see people straight out of journalism school. And so I think it's employers being prepared to realize that everybody of every age has something to offer in any workplace, but also just changing the narrative around it, making sure that we are celebrating this sort of, evolution to something that's a bit wiser than we were when we were queuing up to kiss Simon Le Bon at Duran Duran concerts.
I think too, just being able to, when we see these representations of youth or age, being able to mentally connect them. So you look at someone, say, in their 60s and say that person may well be a grandparent of someone in Gen Z. You look at a Gen Zer and say that person is connected to, say, a Gen Xer. And so it goes. So we get that sense of the totality of society and the generations working together rather than pulling each other apart and pulling against one another. If you could, make that mental, just assign that mental tag to it. It's like, what, you're actually a grandchild. You're a grandparent, you're a mother, you're a father. We all do have each other's interests at heart because we're interwoven societally. Yes, we're different, but ultimately we're trying to create something that is great that is helpful for all of us because we are all connected. To assume otherwise, it is just a recipe for division, and we need less division now rather than more.
Exactly. A great call to end on the podcast there. Tim Wilson, Josie Pagani, thank you so much. A great reminder that we're all in this together. We're all part of that great fabric that is woven throughout the world, and we all need each other. No generation is an island. We can't do it all ourselves. So thank you, both of you, so much for being here. And it's been a really productive and interesting conversation.
Kia ora. Thanks.
Thanks, guys.